7:01. There we go. It is 7:01. I'm calling to order the Common Council Ordinance Committee regular meeting for September 19th, 2023. We have present with us Jim Freyer, Josh Goldstein, Nora Najelski-Eichner, Lisa Shanahan. We expect to have Ed Camacho join us in a few minutes. I'll try to note when he joins us. Can you tell us, Larry, if there's anybody here for public comment?
We have one person dialed in. I'm not sure if it's Telesco or someone from the public, but if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand electronically and I will unmute you. Okay. Go ahead. You can unmute.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Diane Lauricella. I couldn't get on my computer today, so I'm calling in for tonight's meeting. I first wanted to say that I'm very pleased that your item in the minutes, there was quite a bit of information, backup information about the leaf blower ordinance, and I really appreciate that, to have that indoctrinated, institutionalized in the record. So that's terrific. With item 7, I also wanted to say I'm very much in favor of the city beginning now finally to get into complete streets. So I think it's a great effort. I'm here tonight mainly, though, in the minutes I have, just to talk about tonight's meeting item related to the affordable housing. One thing that I'm very much in favor of having an affordable housing committee. I say I'm very in favor of this ordinance. However, I wanted to see if there could be clarification in the ordinance in the language under section 1.5 and 1.6, especially where it talks about qualified expenditures and sources of funding, but mainly 1.6, qualified expenditures relating to the issue of ADUs, both attached and detached accessory dwelling units. There is a reason why less than 300 attached ADUs were applied for from the 1980s through 2022, when the Planning and Zoning Commission took up the issue of amending the ADU regulations. The thing is, I think it's very important under qualified expenditures in this ordinance that there be some way, although I'm sure the staff might tell you it's implied that ADUs are included. I don't think to the public and development community it is that obvious yet. So I ask that you find a way to have additional articulation of the attached and detached accessory dwelling units in this document, so that we make sure that they would be included as a qualified expenditure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diane. Any other people lined up for public comment, Larry?
There's another person. If you'd like to speak, Nicole, please raise your hand electronically now. I do not see anyone else.
Okay, great. So I will close public comment now. I would at this time like to hear a motion for the acceptance of the minutes of July 18th. If somebody would make a motion. Thank you, Nora. All in favor of accepting the minutes as they are filed with the agenda? Okay, that's unanimous among who is attending. That's great. Now I'd like to have a motion to move up the conversation that's listed under new business, discuss the City of Norwalk Complete Street Ordinance following a presentation on that matter, so that we can allow our consultants to leave before all of our business is done. So if someone would make a motion that we can amend the agenda to move up the complete streets conversation, that would be great. Thank you, Josh, for making that. All in favor? That's unanimous. Great. So we can turn the conversation over. Greg, I'll just turn it over to you to introduce your consultant and lead the conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you for all the committee members for having us here tonight. My name is Greg Selly, Transportation Planner for the Transportation Mobility and Parking Department. With us here tonight is Mike Morehouse and Hannah Brockhouse of FHI Studios. FHI Studios is the city consultant for managing the Complete Streets policy, ordinance, design guide creation, and implementation. They're here tonight to talk to you a little bit more about Complete Streets and the policy and ordinance perspective on that. And so they're going to do a presentation for you all and do some questions as well afterwards. So we'll hand it over to Mike and Hannah, and they'll take it from here.
Excellent. Thank you, Greg. And good evening, everyone. Thanks for having us. We have a relatively brief agenda for you, and hopefully you can all, if you don't see my screen, let me know, but it should be up on there now. This is really about getting to the ordinance, and Hannah's going to go over the framework of the ordinance in a few minutes. That's really the meat of this presentation. But I do want to start with a little overview of Complete Streets, just to kind of bring us all up to the same level of understanding. And then we'll quickly touch on the upcoming public engagement exercises that are going to be happening over the next week or so. So, and I know many of you probably know this by now, but the Complete Streets movement is really about designing streets for safety, mobility, accessibility of all users, regardless of age, ability, or mode. It's worth mentioning, and you see this photograph here on the bottom, that, you know, streets really have always been a platform for generating wealth. It's really the lifeblood of cities. You know, in the early 1900s, streets were shared. They were shared by people who walked, bike, you know, rode horses, slow moving automobiles, and they were a place where economic and social exchange happened. As the automobiles proliferated in the country, streets started to get redesigned. The modernist movement decided that streets were better suited for the movement of vehicles, the parking of vehicles, and that was really the future, the way streets needed to be designed. And that's been damaging in many cities, not all, but in certainly many cities, that's eroded some of the wealth creation of great streets. It certainly created safety issues. And one of the things that it probably did the most was the redesign of streets sort of neglected a wide swath of people. And, you know, clearly not everybody drives. There are people that are dependent on transit that don't own automobiles. There are people with disabilities that oftentimes design completely ignores. And of course, many young children who aren't of the age of driving need to get around in other ways. And unfortunately, the streets don't always do a good job of accommodating many of these people. I'd say furthermore, there's an increasing number of people who are just choosing to live in places that they don't have to be auto dependent, that they have more choices. And I think that's what's going to help position cities such as Norwalk for the future, being a place where people do have the choice of how they get around. The other thing I want to say about Complete Streets is that it's not just what happens within the curb to curb width. Clearly, Complete Streets still need to accommodate traffic, but it also, you know, they need to provide the spaces for other modes of transportation, like transit, like biking. But it's also what's happening behind the curb. How do we repurpose spaces to make better use of the pedestrian realm and the curbside space? Does it always need to hold parked cars? It can be used for other things like expanding businesses out onto the street, right up to the frontage of the building. It's also where trees can be planted and other amenities, light poles and benches and trash receptacles and things like that keep the city neat and clean. So the entire right-of-way really needs to be thought about in Complete Streets. It's something which really often isn't done, not to any degree of consistency in many cities, including Norwalk. In 2019, the city adopted the Plan of Conservation and Development, and it emphasized that Norwalk is going to be a city of transportation choice. The subsequent Transportation Master Plan rolled out a series of goals, very ambitious goals that included equity, resiliency, safety, environment choice, and use of technology in transportation. And these goals are really also aligned with how the federal government is positioning money for transportation. So for grant applications, for example, oftentimes you have to prove that you're addressing the equity component, or that you're designing with resiliency and safety in mind, and so on and so forth. So this is really well aligned with our funding mechanisms that are out there today. Currently, streets are classified. On the left, it's a little hard to see this graphic, but functional classification has been the tool that's been used by states, cities, federal government for many years to determine how roads function, whether they fulfill a mobility role or an accessibility role, that is access to businesses. The reality is many streets have to satisfy both of those roles. Some don't do a very good job of it. And it's got a very small number of different classifications, namely arterials, collectors, and local roads. What a complete streets approach does is it has a much more nuanced definition of streets that recognizes context. So how are streets used? Who uses them? What modes exist on those streets? What are the land use like? Are they commercial? Are they residential? Are they industrial? And what are the accommodations necessary to satisfy those particular uses? So we're moving to an approach where we're going to have many more definitions of streets and different design flexibility to provide designers and planners more tools in the kit to design those streets with more users in mind. We also have to recognize that Complete Streets does more than just deal with mobility. Many of our streets contribute to heat islands. As climate continues to warm, so do our cities, and so do the areas with large impervious surfaces. We know that chronic illnesses, including asthma, are very, very serious issues in a lot of cities. And these things do tend to also align with neighborhoods with high concentrations of minority and low income populations. So there's clearly an equity issue that Complete Streets helps address. And then, of course, crashes. Everybody knows that we're back on the uptick in terms of crashes nationally and in the state. And of course, there's been a really unfortunate increase in crashes with bicyclists and pedestrians, often contributing to serious injury or fatality. So that's a very serious issue that Complete Streets could also help address. And then resiliency. Norwalk is a coastal city, and we know that the storm events have become more frequent, more intense, and that storm water that comes from many of our streets eventually concentrates and creates flooding in areas downstream. Streets also have the ability to be designed to help intercept some of that storm water and deal with it before it becomes a storm or a flood event. And so this is a real opportunity to rethink what happens not only on top of the streets, but what happens beneath the streets. And economic vitality. Of course, it's expensive to own and operate a vehicle, so providing people with choice is really good, but also increasingly cities that provide accommodations for active transportation have been gaining in popularity. That leads to further economic development. And so Complete Streets is really, kind of an evolution of the city. If done right over time, this will be a major attraction for people to come and live and work and visit the city. At least we believe it is. And then I'm gonna conclude with this graphic. There's a lot of elements to the overall policy for Norwalk. We want to talk tonight about the ordinance, but there's also going to be an associated design guide, which will provide the tools that practitioners need to help select treatments for streets and design them. There'll be an integration plan, which will look across all the departments within the city to ensure that the daily workflow recognizes Complete Streets, and all the different organizations are talking with one another in order to implement. And then a strong engagement component, and we'll talk about our public meeting next week, but also some of the interesting demonstration project work that we'll be doing next spring. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Hannah. She's going to walk you a little bit through the best practices of the ordinance. Again, we don't have anything to really review yet. We're still in the drafting stage of this, but at least at that very high level, we'd like to give you a little glimpse of what we think will be in the ordinance.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so he's really teed me up well. The Complete Streets policy we want to really focus on tonight, obviously with this committee, but it's really it's really essential to how Complete Streets is going to get built in Norwalk. It's the legal foundation for how this is going to happen. And so we're really taking a fine tooth comb to address all of the, although the last 20 years of kind of practitioner lessons learned for how to implement Complete Streets effectively and successfully across the country. So what this ordinance is going to ultimately look like, it's going to be about a 10 to 20 page document with each of the 12 sections that are laid out on the screen that I'm going to walk through in just a minute. As Mike said, we're developing this with TM&P right now and the partnering departments across the city. As you'll start to see in a moment when I go over these sections, that's really critical to kind of having these decisions laid out to be successful in implementing. And we're expecting to have a complete draft for your review in a couple of months. So now I'm just going to start walking through each of these sections to kind of give you a sense of what this is going to look like ultimately. So the first couple of sections, the whereas statements that precede the policy and the policy itself are really establishing a commitment and vision for Complete Streets. What is this going to do for the city? Why is the city pursuing this? And really clearly addressing the multimodal goals of the policy. This is where we're going to tie in all of these all of the policy and previous planning that Mike has had alluded to earlier, and allows us to touch on these goals like equity, prioritizing underinvested and underserved communities, also kind of aligning with these funding goals that are increasingly prioritized at really all funding levels. The next section is cross-jurisdictional policy. We know that we need to work with other agencies that own and maintain roadways within the city. So that's what this is really covering. And similarly, with the following section, applicability, making sure that we're being very clear that this applies to all projects and all phases of work that involve a roadway. So whether it's early project identification, what goes into the capital plan, all the way through design of streets and resurfacing, maintenance and operational issues, as well as private development projects, any new roadways or connections among roadways, that is all applicable to this policy. The next section of the ordinance is really establishing the baseline. So it's underscoring what the reference point is that we're referring to here. So referring back to pre-existing planning work that establishes things like the crash heat map that you see on the screen. The following section is a really critical one. We want to be establishing excellent design guidance for streets that are built going forward, so that not only city staff, but also outside consultants and private developers have a common reference point to know this is what the city expects to be built going forward on their streets. As we're developing this design, a design guide, some of it's going to look somewhat similar to that example, and also looking at referencing other guides to make sure that we have a clear and complete picture of what should be referenced.
Sorry, Hannah, you could just tell me next slide.
It's okay.
I'm trying to anticipate.
It's okay. You're doing really well, mostly. The next section is implementation. This is really kind of where the rubber meets the road. Over the class, nearly 20 years of Complete Streets implementation, practitioners have increasingly realized that in order to achieve different outcomes than what have happened in the past, we need to be thinking about changing the way that we operate as departments in order to make these changes. So things like the project development process, design guidelines, as I've just alluded to, and also how do we measure success? What are the performance measures that we want to be looking for going forward? The next section is Complete Streets Advisory Committee. And this kind of ties into what I was just saying. How do we measure success and how do we provide oversight in this process? So similar to many other committees that exist, this would include appropriate staff as well as public representatives to underscore and kind of provide guidance on some of the issues that are described elsewhere in the process. And similarly, establishing a public feedback mechanism. This is not just for typical, street design projects, but also thinking about complete streets project prioritization overall. Thinking about how the capital plan projects move forward, et cetera. Finally, or not finally, one of these key items in this last like set of ordinance sections is the exceptions process, which is really important to get right and to be very clear with. There are some clear examples when exceptions are important, but should be, but the process to kind of move forward with this should be carefully considered with a high level of approval and potentially public notice. This is things like where a transportation facility isn't necessarily the use of a transportation facility isn't allowed by law. So thinking about your limited access highways, that's a classic example. But in a more realistic case or a more kind of challenging and hard to anticipate case, thinking about where regulatory compliance requirements might preclude accommodations or create potential adverse impacts, which could be kind of weighing at or close to or significantly overweighing the potential benefits of the implementation of complete streets. So, if we think about wetlands right adjacent to a right of way, that could prevent some widening, or which could otherwise have a big impact on helping us achieve complete streets in different environments. So establishing that process, and then these last few are really kind of thinking about the longevity of this policy. Firstly, reporting, I've already kind of alluded to this. How do we measure success of the policy? This can be things like miles of bike facilities, but it can also be measuring ridership and use. We know that as communities build out networks, ridership goes up. So that's an important measure to consider. I also pulled up this flyer from the Norwalker program. We've been having conversations with different departments across the city to think about ways that these departments are already collecting data that we could potentially use to help evaluate complete streets. The next section is training. It's important to consider the commitment to training. There's a lot of increased guidance out there, and increasingly workshops are available to help think about complicated design challenges that other communities are facing, so that we can really pull the best practices for Norwalk. And finally, consistency and re-examination, thinking about consistency across planning documents, not just in the past, but also moving forward, and making sure that the policy stays current to the city's goals. So that was a lot that I walked through very quickly. I know we're coming up on time, probably. I just want to end by noting that this is really the result of a comprehensive review of not just all of the policies that have been enacted in Connecticut, but also national best practices, some of which are highlighted on this table. You can see that, as you go through kind of older policies, as complete streets was first getting enacted, there was a lot of kind of more simplistic policies really highlighting those goals. But over time, practitioners have realized that it's important to be having these decisions about implementation. What are the roles and responsibilities? What is the exceptions process to ensure that this is really got enough teeth to be successful and really be able to scale? And so Norwalk's putting a lot of effort towards this piece, because this is kind of really the critical part in achieving success and building on a network, which is what everyone wants to see, is kind of this successfully implemented. So with that, I'm going to quickly highlight our workshop, which we were discussing a little bit earlier, 5:30 to 8:30 next Thursday, the 28th. We've got an open house, a presentation, a small group activity, and we will also be launching an online survey at that point so that we can get feedback from a broader group of folks. So we'd love to see you there.
Yeah,
So I
thank
have
you.
one
Thank
question,
you.
if we could take a big step back on, can we go back 2 slides if we could to your, one, oh yeah, that's it. The one with the pink. Yes, that's it. So because we have like this, one lane that we do, the ordinance section. So can you give us the reason why we need to have an ordinance in Norwalk to do this? Like a lot of this seems like policy. Some of it seems like what DPW ought to be doing and TMP should be doing, but why do we need an ordinance to establish this work? Just as a baseline.
I'll start, Hannah, and you can add on if I miss anything, but the ordinance is really the framework of how we get it done. It basically codifies that, you know, complete streets is something that the city wants, that there's good reasons for it. And there's a whole series of these sections that basically codify how it gets done. So, you know, we want this to be survivable over time. You know, we want this to last multiple administrations. We want this to be the way that Norwalk conducts business as it relates to street design, maintenance, and enforcement, and everything else for the future. So it's really like a paradigm shift. Many departments are thinking complete streets. They don't all have the right tools or the right, basically the feel they have the appropriate approvals to kind of do things differently, right? There's a lot of there's a lot of stagnation, I think, in the industry. There's a lot of manuals that are very old and outdated. Norwalk has a very old, outdated street manual. I think DPW really would love to do more creative street design, but right now the tools that are at their disposal are pretty limited. And they, you know, they're built upon decades and decades of kind of auto-oriented design. So this basically establishes that framework that we're going to think differently. We're going to think about different users, different modes, and try to think about a more balanced system. And then it's going to provide a new set of tools that will help guide, you know, whether it's TMP or whether it's DPW or anybody else that has a hand in street design and implementation. You know, this is how it gets done. It's sort of the authority to kind of do things a little bit differently.
So I have one last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to my committee members who have questions. But are there other city documents that we ought to be taking a look at, like the comprehensive, the conservation planning document that we often use, and you know, that do every 10 years and things like that? Are there other documents like that we ought to be imprinting this into?
I mean, I think it's good to know what your POCD
POCD
lays out, obviously. And I know that document is used periodically by TMP to kind of ensure that, you know, what we're doing is still in alignment with that. I think the transportation master plan is something you should be familiar with. I mean, that establishes like this new framework of goals and how we want to measure success. And I think Complete Streets will build upon that. Now Complete Streets will say, okay, now how do you work in equity and resiliency and environment and safety and all that stuff into street planning and design. So this is really kind of the tool to help achieve some of those broader goals.
Great. Mr. Goldstein, you've had your hand up for a little bit.
Yeah, I think if you wouldn't mind just taking the slide down.
Sure.
I will say, you know, I think, first of all, I think this is, I mean, Complete Streets is absolutely the way of the future. And this is something we should be getting into. I am interested, and I think Ed's probably in his hand up for the same reason, about sort of what are things we can actually enact and what is just policy. Because, you know, I see that you've made a list and you have a table in your, I think it's table 2 on sort of, you know, who's done various Complete Streets policies, but like, I don't even know from this if, for example, Fairfield, which seems to have checked off a lot of the boxes on the table, actually has an ordinance that would serve as a reference for us. Usually when we draft ordinances, we like to see who else has done it and who else has done it well. And I haven't heard yet sort of who in Connecticut's done it well. I see that in the presentation, we would be the 12th or 13th municipality that would be doing this. So I kind of want to know who's doing this right. What are some things we can learn from other municipalities? The other thing is there are a lot of policy goals here, but I generally, when we're talking about creation of ordinances, I'd like to know sort of what the enabling statute permits us to put in an ordinance versus not. Obviously, the state of Connecticut has passed legislation. I don't know from this presentation yet, and obviously I just haven't done my own independent research into this, sort of what they've allowed municipalities to have decision-making and discretion on, and what the state has reserved for itself. You know, and I also was interested in your lessons learned section, and I think this is something that you discussed about how you frame this in terms of land use and zoning. Obviously, we've been having this active zoning rewrite process going on right now. I'm wondering how much of this has been or needs to be reflected in our zoning regulations, and how there is a little bit of a disconnect between what we can legislate by ordinance, what needs to be in by an amendment to the zoning regulations, or if it's already in the new zoning regulations and I just don't know it. So those are just sort of some general thoughts that I have. I realize it's, I kind of threw a lot at the wall there, but that's where I'm coming from right now. I don't know if there's anything you can help to sort of supplement where I'm coming from here.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. No, it's a great series of questions. I think, first of all, the ordinance sections that we have now are best practices. The National Complete Streets Coalition does a really good job of collecting and evaluating all of the ordinances and policies nationally. And they're a great wealth of resources. I encourage you to go look up National Complete Streets Coalition to take a scan through some of them if you want. They have a model policy, which is kind of what we're following. Now, we want to customize it for Norwalk's unique condition. You asked about other cities in the state that are doing it well, and I say they're all doing it well to varying degrees. Okay, like I was involved with one of the first ones, which was New Haven's about 12, 13 years ago. If you look at it now, you think, wow, it's really outdated, but it was the first, it was one of the first design guidelines, and it won a national award at the time that really started to integrate bicycle lanes and other features into the streets. And, unfortunately, it was the result of a number of pedestrian fatalities that sort of galvanized support around it. But it provided that framework and that tool for the city to then go ahead and start designing differently. And now it's just evolved and evolved and evolved. And they're probably leading, the state in terms of making their streets safe and accessible for all people. But they've been at it for, well over a decade now. I will say that right now with Norwalk, this is probably going to be the most complete policy in the state of Connecticut, in the sense that it includes not only the ordinance, but the design manual. And I think, Josh, the other thing you talked about was, how does this get reflected in regulations throughout the city? And that's where the integration plan comes in. We're going to be looking at all of those regs, and we're going to be identifying places where complete streets can have an impact, and providing guidance as to which pieces need to be amended or modified in order to reflect complete streets. So I'm not familiar with another community in Connecticut that's gone that far, but it's incredibly important when the city is so complex and there's so many different departments responsible for things that we make sure that we look across all of the various codes and regs to the city to modify. And then what is I think you asked what the city has responsibility over, and largely this is the city maintained street network. Obviously, we're going to look at there are state roads, state DOT roads that we have in our network, but that's going to require sort of a different level of communication and cross institutional coordination to make sure that those streets, when they're up for maintenance or whatever, that the state you work with the state DOT to ensure that complete streets is part of the process. And I think DOT has sort of embraced complete streets at this point. They're well aware of how to do streets design. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, there was an announcement from the DOT. Their design manual now has been amended to include design guidance for all modes, all users. So this is really, so again, there's stuff that the city will have control over, kind of whenever you guys get the funding to do things. And then there's other things that may be a little bit longer term that would require more coordination with the state.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. I also think, and I don't mean to hog, and I know Ed has a question, but one thing look, I'm very biased, but I think we have the best TMP department in the state. They have been, incredibly forward thinking in terms of bike lanes and really sort of being able to push forward. One thing I would want to make sure is still the case, that the ordinance doesn't constrain their ability to engage in creative decision-making and creative solutions to traffic and mobility and parking problems. And I don't I don't know if this has been in your experience, but in terms of thinking about how you attack, an ordinance like this, which is frankly going to have to be a little more general because the technology, technology, best practices are all rapidly improving. I mean, there's been a huge amount of change. I mean, even in the last 10 years. So I don't know if this is something that's sort of you've experienced or have watched other municipalities deal with. I mean, you talk about New Haven, which is a 15-year-old ordinance. A question that I have is, has it been amended sometime in the last 5 years, 5-10 years? And what have those amendments been? So like, I just, you don't have to answer that right now, but I think I want to know sort of what the cutting edge is in terms of ordinances, how it's worked, but also making sure that we don't constrain our city departments from pushing the ball forward. So I'm going to hand it off to him.
I'll just say that the guidance on complete streets design is evolving all the time. I think, Hannah showed you a bunch of documents, NACDO, you can go down the line. There's all kinds of great resources, and we encourage the city to keep up with those. Now, we also want to make sure that the city has its own context specific guidance in standards that the designers can use. But what we really want to do is set up the street network to recognize context first and foremost. And then the design guide is going to allow the flexibility for designers to do what they do best, right? To come up with the best engineering solutions. We're not prescribing things per se, but we're saying this is the kind of street where you want to think about, these kind of lane widths, and you have to ensure that there's sidewalks and they should be at a minimum, they should be this width, and there should be tree canopy, and we're kind of giving some guidance as to what would be ideal, what would be preferred, what would be not appropriate for a street. Just way more definition than they currently have, but ultimately the process of design won't change. We still need creative people to think specifically, how are you going to do this for the entire street? And sometimes streets change block to block. So there's still going to be a lot of flexibility to make sure that we're being creative and and open and flexible.
That's great. So Ed Camacho has a question. He joined the meeting, by the way, for purposes of the minutes around 7:15.
Yes, thank you. I apologize for joining late. So my question was something along the lines of what Josh asked. Are there examples of ordinances throughout the state, either in Connecticut or New York or surrounding states, of the type that you're contemplating here? Number one. Number two, I'm trying to wrap my brain around what this adds to what DPW is already doing. I imagine that they have engineers and people that think about the best way of doing things when they're planning out streets or rerouting streets and things like that. And number three, I've been to New Haven a lot of times. I don't see anything that's particularly unique or different or better in New Haven than we have here in Norwalk. So I'm just wondering what examples of the type of a street design that you're referring to, or that we're talking about here, might there be in a place like New Haven that began this process a number of years ago?
So we do have a best practices memorandum, which I don't know if you guys have seen or not. Greg, has that been released to this group? Basically, this is the memorandum that looked at all of those case studies, the 12 or so Connecticut ones and the other national best practices. And we kind of summarized those, the New Havens and some of the earlier, manuals that were done in early 2000s, middle 2000s, 2015. And so only really kind of included design guidance, didn't really have a whole lot of, so sometimes they don't even include an ordinance. There are communities such as New Britain, which didn't feel they needed one. Their DPW director just had a complete streets mindset and started doing things. And then that became, it was kind of a snowball effect. They started getting money for street design grants, and it snowballed, and they kept on adding on different phases. And then they were really able to sort of reimagine a lot of their downtown streets, new bridges, new streetscapes, a lot of things like that. So A policy isn't always necessary, and every city seems to do it a little bit differently. But I'd say Fairfield and Madison, they check a lot of the boxes. Bridgeport recently just completed a design resource. It hasn't been rolled out publicly yet, but that's NV5 did that, and they're on our team for this project, so they bring that experience to bear. And then we included some national examples that have all the elements that we're talking about here. But Norwalk is really unique in the sense that we are thinking about this as a very robust resource. We want to make sure that this, again, when whoever the next first official is, whatever the next committee is, however the city reorganizes in the future, we don't lose focus on complete streets. And that's why we're really trying to have all of these different resources, including the ordinance, developed for this.
Well, I want to say one thing about, just to kind of give Ed a little bit of context, because I've been working on street trees for the last 4 years, it seems like every single day. And we took a lot of information and a lot of guidance from New Haven, because one of the things that Norwalk sadly has not been doing very well is street trees. And we have one of the lowest tree canopies in the whole state of Connecticut. So we look to New Haven to come up with a program for giving trees away and having trees in the right of ways and things like that. And so it is something that I think Norwalk can learn from other cities, especially just in that little slice of complete streets, just an amenity zone that could really be more robust than we've had in the past, and more commitment to that amenity zone.
I would say to your question about what's different, I think New Haven's kind of a planned city. It's got one center and it radiates outward. I think Norwalk's really the collection of multiple towns and centers that have been stitched together over the years, and so you're kind of monocentric, and so there's a lot of variety. There's a lot of much narrower, twisty, constrained streets, but you have a lot of really whether it's Wall Street or Sono or Rowayton or East Norwalk or your Main Street, you have lots of commercial streets that are really great streets, and then you have other streets that are hilly, windy, almost rural in nature, and there's I think a lot more diversity and variability in the Norwalk system, so it's really challenging. So a street designer really has to think about a lot of things when they're designing in Norwalk, but the desire to connect all of these different centers and make Norwalk a place where you really can walk, or ride bike or take a bus to satisfy all your daily needs is going to take some work. It's going to take some rethinking of how the streets affect all people, so that you don't have to drive every place and park your car and then do what you need to do. Norwalk is a little easier.
Sorry, I just want to interject quickly to your question about other examples in Connecticut. One example that we've looked at is the West Hartford policy. It's got a lot of these same elements that we're talking about. It really lays out a lot of details on implementation. So that could be a useful reference point.
Great, thank you. Mrs. Nojelski-Eichner, she's got her hand up, and then Jim will go to you.
Jim, is it a follow-up question? No. Okay. So I think building on what you just sort of described, in terms of Norwalk, I think as a general sort of objective, I think this is something we all tend to sort of agree, or I don't know, I shouldn't say we all. I certainly am positive about, more street trees. I'm positive about increasing sidewalks and biking. I'm a little bit concerned that we're going to run into one of either the exceptions are going to swallow the rule here, that the enormous variability of our, just the size of our right-of-ways alone. I mean, that is one of our major issues in the city, right? And this ordinance is not going to be able to solve that. And so there's part of me that is a little concerned that approaching this as an ordinance may not be quite the right solution to the variability that we have, or at least the ordinance may need to be sort of smaller or more constrained or limited to certain kinds of streets, because otherwise are we going to be designing 10, 15 different, kinds of streetscapes? And does that sort of become so unwieldy in and of itself that it's not actually that helpful? And I think the other, deeply closely related issue here is that, and I'm all for aspirational. Sometimes we need to set a goal. We need to develop a vision. But these are potentially very long range projects for a lot of these streets, right? And I'm just a little concerned that given the budgetary constraints, that we have and that we face, if this is more of a sort of, this is how we're going to approach the projects that we are currently have funding for, that is fine and makes sense. But again, then I'm just not totally sure if a citywide ordinance is quite the right way to approach the sort of the spaces we have available and the funds we have available. So I'm not saying, I just worry that it's overkill for what we actually have the ability to do potentially.
So let me just, I want to take one of Nora's thoughts and just like really focus it a little bit. I think like design guides and things like that are not things that we tend to like to put in ordinances because we like to have the flexibility to change our minds about design guides and things like that. I presume that that's how you would write an ordinance, right? You wouldn't be including design guides that are, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, we didn't intend to get into some of we could show you examples of what the design guidance looks like in this case. So those context zones that I showed you in the early map. So now, like, think of Norwalk. You got basically 3 street types today. We're going to expand that to 10 or 11 street types, right? And those street types will have, it's more guidelines than specific standards. And so what we'll do with those guidelines is suggest, more progressive treatments for the street. Again, we're not designing it. We're going to give an illustration of what that street could look like if it had a bike lane or other infrastructure. We can talk about what the preferred, lane widths and other street uses are, what the accommodation should be for like the amenity zone. Should a street have benches? Should it have trees? Should it have garbage pails? Things like that. We're gonna just basically provide recommendations for what the street could potentially include. It's still, again, it's really still up to designers to decide how that street actually gets built. But the manual, it's not going to be like your standard engineering manual where you see a cross section. Well, you're going to see cross sections, but you're not going to see, the slope of the crown of the road and how the slope of the curb ramp to the sidewalk is and what the curb material is made of. You're not going to see very specific guidance like that. That's stuff that rests in design manuals. What you're going to see more are guidelines to follow given the street in question. So that, a designer will approach the complete streets map and they'll say, oh, okay, this is a village commercial road or whatever we decide to call it. And then they're going to open up a series of pages for that type of road. And they're going to see a whole bunch of sort of preferred best practices for how to deal with that type of road. And then they're going to consult whatever manuals they need to do the design. So, what you said about exceptions is really real. Some roads are going to have, so for example, if there needs to be a bicycle lane that runs a mile along a street, and then at one point there's a pinch point because there's a bridge, and the bridge is going to be $5 million to replace. The benefit of putting that bicycle lane across the bridge may not outweigh the cost of replacing a bridge just to put a bike lane in. So, there'll be a process for, okay, that might be something we request an exemption for. A steering committee, complete streets committee can take a look at that, agree, whatever, and then the project can get done a different way without that piece of it. But we want to make sure that the exceptions aren't so loose that they become something that just basically people throw away the whole design process, because almost everything could be viewed as a constraint. The other thing I'll just say about complete streets is it's incremental over time. Clearly, there's going to be standalone projects that grant funding will be available for, and like what's going on in Wall Street, a lot of money's going into that. That's an opportunity to do something different with the streets. But there's also routine annual maintenance, repaving, just rehabilitation of streets, things like that, which, as those projects go forward, we'll now have a set of guidelines to say, okay, now when that street gets redone, it should include whatever, 2 travel lanes instead of 3 with a bike lane or a wider sidewalk or whatever. So that's kind of, this is something that's going to be a process, and it may take many, many years before you start to see really solid network, results. But incrementally, streets will start to get better over time with an approach like this.
And I
Wait,
think
Jim-
just to,
oh, sorry.
oh, sorry, I'm just gonna put a pin on what Mike said, which is, part of these sections that we recommend including in the ordinance start to spell out kind of roles and responsibilities to ensure that design, we're looking at the design of the street before we go out and repave it. So that we have that opportunity. And so it's spelling out the timeline and the process and the roles and responsibilities to do that type of work so that we're not relying on the huge grant funded projects that only come around so often.
Thank you. So Jim, you've had your hand up. Sorry, Jessica. Jim had his hand up before you, and then we'll go to Jessica.
Yeah, I think the more we talk about this, the less I'm inclined to think that an ordinance is really in our future. I think about the roads that we have in Norwalk, and as Mike said, they're some are wide, some are windy, some are rural looking, some are urban looking, and it's all the same road throughout the city, and yet there are portions of it that are owned by the state, and then they run into a piece that's owned by the city. And then, now we're talking about, all I can see is an ordinance that's going to just be addressing nothing but exceptions to the rule all the time. I'd love to see an example of, or maybe you could refer to some city that has got a diverse network, of roads as I think Norwalk has, which I've never seen anyplace else, and how they handle something like this. As we talk more and more, and we talk about exceptions, and we talk about designs, and looking at the design of a road, and that dictates what you can do with it, or what our design criteria is, and that'll see whether we can repave it or not repave it. I'm just getting more and more confused as to, the immensity of any kind of an ordinance that's going to cover all of those exceptions that we have in this city. Are there other cities that have the diversity of roads that interweave? The same road can be very wide, can be very narrow, can be twisty, can be rural, can be very urban.
A road, a single road can go through multiple contact zones. It can change depending on where it is, as you say, right? So that you'll see from the network. Plus,
but in certain places, it may be a section of it may be owned by the state, another section may be owned by the city. So you have to have this agreement between the DOT and the city becomes really important. A lot of work has to go into that, I would expect.
Yeah, and again, like sometimes, if a road is 4 miles long and it changes multiple times and under multiple ownership, projects don't often go the entire stretch of the road. Projects are deal with segments of the road, and the idea is if a project is going to include maybe a half a mile segment of that, now you look at, okay, how should that road be reprogrammed as it gets rehabilitated? And maybe in the case of something like a bicycle lane, you might have to think very carefully about whether or not you want a bicycle lane to end. But you want to find, usually projects are defined, there's a sort of a common, or there's a segment of independent utility, for example, a segment of the road that serves a particular function. So there are cases where roads are built a certain way, and it seems a little bit awkward where the termination point ends, because maybe a bike lane has to now transition to something else, or maybe it transitions to the Norwalk River Valley Trail and it doesn't continue on road. But the point is that over time, as multiple different segments of that road get addressed, that there becomes a little bit more of a common design standard that forms a full network over time. But Complete Streets does recognize that it all can't be done at once, and it needs to be done incrementally, and smart decisions need to be made, so you don't just terminate a bike lane and the bikes are now forced to flow into the general traffic lanes, and that creates a safety problem. So those are all issues that get addressed with just smart planning and design.
But isn't that just best practices of design? I mean, isn't that best practices that we would think that that our Public Works Department would be able to follow? I mean, I guess I just don't see the need for an ordinance for our Public Works Department to implement or to follow best practices when they're repaving a road or widening a road or narrowing a road, whatever.
Well, what if you hire a public works director someday who doesn't believe in it?
Mike, if you don't mind if I just jump in, one thing I just want to add to is it also adds a consistency to design as well. Because if we don't have that consistency, then TMP does a project, we do one thing. DPW does another project, they do something else. You know, another department wants to do a grant for another project, and the designer, you know, if it's an outside consultant, you know, they don't have a design guideline to go off of. So they can just design however they feel without any city standard. Well, we do have city standards, but it's not as in-depth as what a complete street guidebook will put out. You know, what's the width of the road should be on a curb extension, you know, minimizing crossing distance, what signal timing should be. So all that kind of plays into the consistency. And if we have, you know, all these different parties going, you know, at kind of rogue with what they want to do, then the city becomes inconsistent. And then when we do make those connections, you know, when these projects intersect each other, the, you know, people who are using the roadway are going from one type to another type, and it gets more confusing. So we just want to create more of a consistent network throughout the city.
Yeah,
Yeah,
on the DPW director. So Josh, let's do one more comment and then we're gonna let these people go because we've got other business.
Yeah,
This is just an introduction to the theory.
The only thing that I would add, and I see Jess has got her hand up, and hopefully, you know, this is sort of a thought for the future, is I think there's a little bit of a cognitive dissonance between planning best practices and various sort of interdepartmental issues versus the sort of fundamental legal questions, because you've got a virtual room mostly filled with lawyers, sort of about what we are legally permitted to do, what other municipalities have done, and frankly, whether what other municipalities have done have worked. I don't have answers to any of those questions right now. And I think that as we go through the process, and frankly, as we figure out, A, is an ordinance the best solution to this? And B, what does that ordinance look like? I think we're going to need to know the answers to those questions, because I think as a theoretical concept, we're in agreement that this is a good idea and that complete streets is an important priority. And this is something I think we've all sort of voted for, various elements of things that would be qualified as complete streets, including increasing bike lane, increasing green space in and around our sidewalks and our roads, so on and so forth. But I think it's a fundamental level. I don't know what an ordinance looks like right now. So I just, as we go through the process and begin to work on this, I think that's sort of a closing thought that I have. So I see that Jess's hand is up. So
Let's have Jess up and then we'll move on to affordable housing.
Hi, everyone. So just a few thoughts from on my end from all of this. One, I think that whether it be misplaced or not misplaced, I think really the impetus of this and the goal of this is to show that the city is absolutely 100% committed to complete streets and being able to focus on thinking of all users of the road in an equitable way and making smart decisions and putting standards in place that will support the city that we want for ourselves, right? And that's in line with the POCD goals and in line with a lot of the other work in which we're doing with mobility and connectivity. Now, I have to say, is the ordinance the only way in which to do this? No, of course not, right? We have city policies, we have city goals and objectives, we have different programs and oversight to be able to ensure that the work that we decide is important to the city is executed. And I think we show that each and every day, regardless of an ordinance being in place or not. So, you know, I think it's really good feedback today. And I think we've heard loud and clear some ideas on different ways in which to support the city in being able to achieve complete street goals and also therefore working to Vision Zero goals. I think, you know, 2022 was actually the one year that we had the lowest number of accidents and crashes in the city of Norwalk. And we just want to continue that trend. And we want to be able to do that in a really equitable way, especially as we see different growth patterns happening in the city, and especially specifically in the urban core around our train stations, and making sure that that we're thinking about mobility and multi-modal aspects when it comes to the train stations and getting people to and from work and first and last mile. So, you know, I wanted to wrap it up and just say, completely hear what everyone is saying, you know, and this might not be the right vehicle per se. Two, even if we don't go with an ordinance, it doesn't really impede our ability to be committed to complete streets in a very meaningful way. And three, you know, it really is a standards discussion and a policy discussion and a protocol discussion on how we want our city to look, and making sure that from an operational policy standpoint all the way down to an operational and construction standpoint, that we really stick to our goals and objectives, much like we would do in any other project, right? So I wanted to just offer those thoughts on the conversation, on the discussion.
That's a great wrap up, Jess. Thank you so much. And Michael and Hannah, thank you so much for coming tonight and just introducing this idea to us. It's obvious that we have a lot to learn about it. And I encourage all of our members who are here tonight to join the session next Thursday night from 5:30 till 8 o'clock at City Hall in the community room, right? Yeah, I think when people start to see this laid out, they'll see why this is such a compelling thing to undertake. That's good. Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We'll let you guys go, and we're going to turn our attention to discussing and voting on the affordable housing ordinance. And I'm turning this over to Nora, who's done all of the heavy lifting on this ordinance.
Good night, everyone. Thank you. And thank you, Lisa. Just to provide a little context in case of the public is interested, and just to refresh, because we haven't talked about this in a few months. So under Norwalk's current zoning regulations and proposed to be continued in the proposed regulations, is a workforce housing regulation. And one component of that workforce housing regulation provides developers with an option to meet some of their workforce housing contribution through contributing money to a fund to be used by the city of Norwalk for building workforce housing. That fund has never actually never really come into existence because it hasn't been created by ordinance. And so the core of this ordinance is creating this affordable housing account and guiding how it will be managed, how the funds will be, how the purposes of the funds will be selected for any given year, and then the applicants chosen, and the funds sort of get out the door. So that's the overarching goal of what we are trying to establish here in this committee, and the sort of the genesis for needing an ordinance to do this. The ordinance as circulated, I have gotten a little bit of feedback from a few folks on a few minor things.
Nora, do you want to share your screen and show it? Is that like a way to go through
that?
it?
Yeah. Okay, great. Give me just
Larry, so if you can help Nora do that just in case.
I think I've got it.
Are you all okay? Just want to make sure you're authorized.
Yep. I can everyone see?
Mhm.
Okay, great. So Lisa, unless you think otherwise, I thought we can just step through, and if people
Yeah.
have
I think that's the best way to do it. Just that'd be great if you would.
Fabulous. So in the preamble, obviously just establishing the purposes of this account. I got a couple of wording suggestions from Councilmember Goldstein. If you want to take a quick look, Josh, as we're going through, and make sure that this reflects the wording that you wanted to change there. And again, if anyone has further objections, terrific. Section 1.2 is the definitions. Again, I don't think anyone had any particular questions or concerns about that, but if there are, there's anything there. Section 1.3 establishes.
Nora, do you want to slow down and just kind of answer Diane's questions about qualified expenditures, like how you maybe just say a word or two about that?
Sure, thank you. And to Ms. Larchella's point, yes, these qualified expenditures would cover accessory dwelling units, whether attached or detached. There's nothing in here that would limit that. And I don't think there's any particular need to specify that. They are buildings or structures. And they are, if they are able to be used for affordable housing, then they would fall under this category. I think the point that she is trying to make about the potential for using these funds to encourage accessory dwelling units, that will really come through the decisions of the committee as to what the criteria for the using of these funds are this, in any given year. And I think that's an important point to make about the overall structure of this ordinance. As is our usual practice, we don't want to be too restrictive here. We are trying to establish a framework through which good decisions can be made that are responsive to the needs in any given year. So we're trying to set up a structure where a committee could say, we see a huge opportunity for accessory dwelling units. We really want to encourage them. We're going to direct the use of funds this year. The application criteria this year are going to be directed at increasing ADUs in the city. And so the qualified expenditures for that year will be expenditures related to ADUs. But this ordinance is not making any sort of particular recommendations as to what should be done in any year, other than restricting these qualified expenditures to physical construction. We really wanted, and this was talked about in great length in the ad hoc committee on affordable housing. We felt that the greatest need in the city right now was to help actually get building done. And in doing so, we really wanted to restrict these to hard costs so that they don't kind of fritter away in planning or anything else. Not that those are bad things, but we really wanted these funds to go to help make buildings happen. And whether that's keeping, affordable housing usable and safe, or whether it's building new units, those are the goals. And similarly, we just in case anyone from the public is interested, I did want to highlight, this was another point that was important to the ad hoc committee. We are setting the affordable housing level here at 60% of the state median income. So that is a level that would be lower potentially than the median income just for Fairfield County. So we are trying to put this at a level that really is directed towards helping our working families, in the sort of lower end of our income bracket. And again, these are people who have in many ways made up a really core part of Norwalk's population for a long time. And with our skyrocketing housing costs are now, at risk of being pushed out of the city. And so they really are a priority to try to find ways that we can help those residents stay in Norwalk and, be part of their contributions that they make to the city. 1.3 then establishes the account. This language should be familiar at this point. It's the language that we use for the cannabis ordinance and the tree ordinance, and I think hopefully covers everything that we need to do under the state statute that allows these kinds of accounts. 1.4 is where we establish the committee. Again, Mr. Goldstein had a suggestion that we change consent of the Common Council to just be clear that we mean by consent of the Common Council, we mean a majority vote. And I think, as we all talked about with the charter, that's the new terminology. We'd like to be consistent and clear. So I thought that was a very good catch. And we had, in fact, used it a couple of sentences further up. And again, I think everyone has had a chance to review this now, but this is a slight revision to the structure that we had brought to this committee in April, merely really clarifying sort of how this would work in terms of the council members and the need for the council members to only serve on this committee if they're still elected to the councils. They will roll off if people are no longer on the council. And similarly, to clarify that the mayor is making the appointments, but they are subject to the majority vote of the council for the 3 resident members. And again, I think B and C are pretty standard sort of committee provisions. And again, ways in which we're trying to be consistent across all of our committees. Section 1.5, just to note that, again, this language is comparable to language that we have used in other sections. I did get a question that I have not yet been able to confirm, Mr. Camacho, but I will follow up on that after this meeting. In section B, this language about being able to invest these funds, Mr. Camacho had wanted to confirm that because these are set in a separate fund, that they could still be used for investment purposes without us needing to so designate. This is language that's been used in the other ordinances, establishing similar kinds of accounts. So I don't think there's an issue, but I will confirm that with Mr. Candela, Mr. Camacho, just to make sure. And again, just to note another, this in section C here, in paragraph C here, all of this money, the original source for this money is the zoning regulation. We do have the language in there as amended and revised so that when the zoning ordinance, when the zoning regulations are eventually adopted, this will continue to track to the new section. Mr. Ferrer, you have a question?
Yeah, and I apologize that we haven't been able to get together during today and discuss this like we had thought we were going to be able to do.
Tried.
But I did have a couple of questions on B and C here.
Okay.
First of all, was that how much money is generated every year? We're talking about a lot of money that's going out to different people for repairing, building, revitalizing their homes and so forth. That seems to be a lot of money. How much money is generated right now? Do we know?
This is not a large amount of money. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I think it's around a couple $100,000 at most right now. So one of the reasons that we're setting this up is that it, as you'll see in this language, the city could then choose to invest additional money in this fund, separate from the money that's currently directed to it through the workforce housing regulation. And the city doesn't currently have any sort of mechanism for funding affordable housing projects per se that are separate from the housing authority. But at this moment in time, and that's again part of why you'll see in 1.6, we are preparing the application criteria are set up each year or each couple of years, because it is a limited amount of funds. So the question is going to be for the committee, what is the best use of funds this year? So it may be that this year we are going to use the funds for facilitating ADUs, or this year we're going to use the funds for facilitating, rehabilitation of existing homes through some kind of, more individually directed process. Or it might be that this year we're going to do one chunk of the money, and the whole money, the whole chunk is going to be used as the city's matching funds for a state or federal grant for a large project. All those kinds of things could be possible through here, and it will be up to the committee to decide in any given year what's our best opportunity to maximize these funds.
How would this differ? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
How would this differ from the redevelopment agency? Redevelopment offers money to homeowners to redo the facade of their house, to improve their property, to build additions, to do the necessary repairs to make the thing stand up. I mean, all of these things are done or facilitated through the redevelopment agency, either by block grants or out and out loans. How does this differ from that?
So that's one of the reasons that the redevelopment agency is not on this committee. They are a potential applicant for these funds. So the city could choose through this process to direct these funds to the redevelopment agency to be used for one of their programs. But this money cannot be given directly, because this is money that comes to the city through the workforce regulations. We can't just direct it directly to redevelopment every year.
No. I'm not saying that we would send it to redevelopment, but I guess, or maybe you're you're telling me something and I'm not picking up on, is that you're saying that these funds that come out of the workforce housing regulations are not passed on to redevelopment. They have to go to this particular committees that we're going to set up. But I'm saying the Norwalk redevelopment does some of these very same things that we're saying that we're going to use these funds for. So people can go to the redevelopment authority for money to repair a front porch, for example. They could do a major renovation on a house. They can build another house. They can borrow quite a bit of money or smaller amounts of money, or they could take advantage of block grants as well. And a lot of this I know, since when I was the president of the of Hilltop Homes in 08, and we had the opportunity to borrow a lot of money from the redevelopment people to do necessary HVAC and other capital improvements to the buildings that we had. So I guess I'm just confused as to what is the difference between the two of them. And
so the difference is that the zoning regulations require developers in certain circumstances to contribute this money to the city. The city then has to have a mechanism for doling that money out. And so the zoning regulations cannot require that the money go directly to the redevelopment agency, because the redevelopment agency is not part of the city. It is a separate authority, right? It's closely related to us, is interrelated, but is not part of the city. So we have to have a mechanism for directing the funds that the zoning regulations require the developers to pay these funds. The city has to have a mechanism for dispersing those funds. The redevelopment, it is possible that the committee could decide that the best use of these funds is to immediately hand them back over to the redevelopment agency. That's why they're not sitting on this committee. Similarly, the Norwalk Housing Authority could also be an obvious potential recipient. They could decide that the best job, thing to do is to direct these funds directly to the Housing Authority. So the Housing Authority is also not sitting on this committee. They were initially involved in these conversations, and we said, we don't want to have a conflict issue here. It doesn't make sense for them to sit on it because they could be applicants. So that is a possibility. It's also a possibility that the city is going to have a different project it wants to do, and it will choose to, the committee will choose to allocate the funds to a different project. The whole point of this is to have a mechanism for getting these funds out the door, which currently can't be spent because there is no mechanism for spending them. And it will be up to this committee to figure out how to do that most efficiently.
so they
That may be
haven't
different
spent
every year.
So they haven't spent any of the money yet.
Correct. None of this money has been spent because
So-
we can't spend it. We don't have a mechanism for doing so.
That's the
And how
purpose.
much money is there?
It's not at this point a lot of money. It's a couple $100,000 because the developers, this is in alternative if the developers don't want to build the required units. So as you may, I think you probably know, but just to refresh if anyone's not interested, our zoning regulations require projects over a certain size to set aside 10% of their housing, 10% of their units for affordable housing.
Right.
If there are certain exceptions and alternatives where they can give the city money instead, or if they're doing a certain kind of units directed at a certain percentage income, then they have to contribute some money as well. So many developers have made the decision to build the units, and therefore they're not necessarily paying a huge amount of money in. But there are some who are. And so we do have money sitting here. We do anticipate that there will be more. It's certainly possible as the zoning regulations get revisited that there will be changes that will increase the amount of money that is required. And these are all things on the table. But the point is that one way or the other, we need a mechanism to spend this money.
Okay. I understand what you're saying, and I don't mean to prolong it, so we
No,
can.
that's fine.
Let's go ahead.
It's important to understand. I think we all need clarity as to
Yeah.
why we're doing this, because the intent is not to create a duplicative program or agency. The intent is to create a way to get the money to whatever agency is doing the best work or the most important work or the most immediate work in any given year, which is why we wanted to leave the options for how it is spent as broad as possible, because we do want this committee to be able to coordinate for, okay, this given year, let's direct this $100,000 to be able to fill out the city's matching grant for the federal, application we're doing, or, redevelopment agency has been overwhelmed with blight applications this year. Let's direct it to them so they can fill up that program and hit all their applications that year. There's going to be moments and options where one thing or another is going to be most effective.
Because the reason I bring it up is that when I sat on the BET this year, when we were going through the budget, I was questioning very, very, I guess, ferociously the amount of money that we were going to be allocating to redevelopment agency, and I was kind of reluctant to give the money that they were asking for, but now I'm seeing that there's other pockets of money around that they probably could have appealed to us to move that out. Also, if it's even a couple $100,000 is just sitting there, how does the finance department account for that?
I genuinely am not sure. I think that they have been sort of,
I think I know the answer to that, Nora.
Okay,
It
good.
gets assigned to an account, and so it sits in the account. And that's why that's the impetus of this whole thing, is it's been sitting into this account without any direction for a couple of years now. So we needed to write an ordinance in order to decide how to disperse it. I see that Ed's hand's been up for a little while. Just wanted to note that, Nora, when you and Jim finish this part of the dialogue.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that's the whole issue, is that they have been in practice sort of keeping this money segregated, but we need a formal way of doing that, and we need to then have an ability to get it out the door.
I got you. I agree with you.
Okay, glad that helps. Ed?
Yeah, so I know that there's something called fee in lieu of parking, so that if you have a leased or building, or you have a building or whatever, you need to have certain number or account for certain number of parking spaces per square footage, per area of space. And I know that tenants or landlords of buildings have the option of paying a fee to the city in lieu of having the requisite number of parking spaces. I believe it was at one point $20,000 per parking space that was required, but they're not providing. So that money presumably sits in some account and can only be used for transportation, parking related things. So is this kind of that same idea? And is there a mechanism currently that you're aware of for that fee in lieu of monies for expenditures of those monies?
An excellent question, and I don't know the answer to it. But we should ask, because it actually strikes me as possible that they are also in need of a similar kind of ordinance to be able to do that.
Well, let me just add to that. We did look at the in lieu of, there's a number of in lieu of accounts, and some of them are fairly significant. And we were able to move, so I believe we were able to move some of the money around during the budget this past year.
Yeah, but that might be a good thing actually to follow up on once we get this done, and see what's happening with those and whether.
Well, no, but I mean, they were.
They are
I think it
usable.
was standard practice that they could use them. I mean, so as Ed says, that they are restricted to some extent. I mean, you just can't use it for anything you want. But there are some restrictions on it, and we were looking at that anxiously, because there's a couple of accounts that are fairly large in there.
Yeah.
Or they were anyway.
It may also be, I don't know for sure, but the zoning regulations are particularly restrictive in this regard. One of the other issues, which is in C, is that that the zoning regulations include deed restrictions for projects that receive these funds. And so it may be that planning and zoning and the finance department felt particularly strongly about having an ordinance for this one, because there are some particular restrictions that come with this regulation and these funds. So perhaps that's why this one sort of rose to the priority list, but it's a good question. We should definitely follow up on for the remainder of these kinds of in lieu of fees.
But
Because we
this
do
one
want
does
equity.
have a deed restriction on it, so it does seem like we would have to have a separate type of organization on it.
Yeah. And so, and that, to close the loop on that. So this deed restriction issue has been talked about quite extensively with the ad hoc committee. It was part of the delay in moving this ordinance forward. There is a lot of concern among the ad hoc committee that the deed restrictions on home ownership, on homes that are owned, or homes that are built through this program that are then intended for ownership, that the deed restrictions are too onerous and fail to allow the homeowners to accumulate sufficient equity to actually really allow them to serve the purpose of homeownership, which is to increase equity. Having spent quite a bit of time looking at it and discussing it, however, that really is a function of the regulations, the zoning regulations. That's not a function that can be solved through this ordinance. And so the committee is going to make recommendations to planning and zoning about amending the workforce housing regulation to address the deed restrictions as they relate to home ownership. As they relate to rental property, I think everyone is in agreement that it is positive. The regulations require these projects that use these funds to be deed restricted to affordable housing in perpetuity. So unlike some of the concerns we've heard with some of the other deed restrictions in some of the apartments, this would be a much more extensive restriction as to the rental units. But again, that is all planning and zoning regulations. That is not anything this ordinance controls or can change. So that's merely for information purposes. But is also, as Lisa said, part of why this particular fund may have, requires its own particular count and approach because of those restrictions. Any other questions on 1.5 before we move to 1.6? Okay. So then 1.6 sets up the process for making the expenditures. And as we discussed, the goal really is to have these application criteria be relevant to the issues in front of the city and the opportunities in front of the city in any given year. So the director of planning and zoning will draft them. They will go to the committee. The committee can amend them. We put a mechanism in here so that the council can override the committee's application if for some reason the council feels the need to do it, but they don't have to. And so it doesn't have to go through the whole committee process or the whole council committee and then full council process if it's not necessary. Given that there will be council members on the committee, the hope is that this will be that there will not be need to exercise that kind of council override, but we did want to have a mechanism in case. In section C here, Mr. Camacho, I hope that this edit addresses your concerns here. We wanted to be very clear that if the council did choose to put additional terms and conditions on any particular application, that it had to be in accordance with the ordinance and the application criteria. They couldn't insert terms and conditions that conflicted. So let me know if that language.
Yeah, that works.
Okay, great. And D, E, and F are again intended to just limit the spending to the qualifying expenditures and not to overspend. 1.7 just requires annual reporting so that the council is aware of what's happening here. And again, I think the hope is that this will also be an opportunity for conversation about our affordable housing in Norwalk. Again, once the affordable housing plan is put out, this creates an opportunity to potentially, again, use this fund for as a way of the city investing in these projects in line with the housing plan. So there may be further opportunities here, and we want to make sure that there's sort of a consistent conversation going on with the council. And 1.8 is the conflict of interest provision, which again, is just basically directing everyone to the existing code of ethics. This does not change the code of ethics. It is merely a reminder, that everyone would apply anyway, but it makes sure that everyone is very clear that the code of ethics applies to this section. And to address an issue that was raised, I think, in our April meeting, to be clear, members of the committee could not seek these funds for the housing in which they reside. And so it will be important for people who choose to be appointed to this committee to understand from the get-go that their housing will not be able to benefit from these funds. And that's a function of the Code of Ethics. That's not a function of this ordinance per se, but it is important to reiterate that. Yeah, further questions, further additions or edits?
So the process now, Nora, if you want to walk some people through that.
So yeah, I mean, at this point, I think we, if we want to vote to approve this as amended, then we will do so. It will then go up, the announcement will go up for public hearing. We'll have our
Right,
public
so
hearing.
Exactly. What we first do is we voted to go to public hearing, which would be next, this version to go to public hearing. And we could maybe make changes based upon what we hear at public hearing at our next meeting, but we would post it up for public hearing on, oh gosh, Matt, do you happen to have the date of the next meeting? The third Tuesday?
Yes, no, it'll be October
I feel like it's the 19th, but I'm not sure. Maybe it's not.
17th, I think. October
17th, yeah, should
17th.
be 2 days different.
Yep.
Right. So I make a motion that we move this affordable housing ordinance as with the amendments that were made today and prior to public hearing on at our next meeting, which is October 17th.
Second
And
that motion.
yeah, actually, I don't think I can make the motion because I'm the chair. I take that back. Can somebody
Fair
else
enough.
make the motion? Right.
Can I make the motion?
You may adopt my motion.
I would like to move that we send this to public hearing with the changes that we made this evening on October 17th.
Great. All in favor? I see 4. Josh, are you here? Like Josh isn't on my my cartoon.
Yes, I raised my
Oh
hand.
yeah, let me
Yes.
let me
Thank
stop
you.
sharing.
Yeah, I can't see Josh. Great. So we have moved that forward. All right, we have one. Thank you there. Thank you, Josh. That has been
Just in
moved forward.
case.
Yep. The last item on our agenda today, which is going to be a very quick item, is to discuss chapter 58A, blight prevention. And I'm going to turn this over to Matt for a little bit of a conversation. This is just an introduction. We're going to look at the language for this at our next meeting on October 17th. Thank you for covering for Brian today too, Matt. We appreciate it.
Sure, no problem. Pleasure to be here. So the city of Norwalk does have a blight ordinance. Recently, the state legislature has enacted legislation that allows municipalities' blight ordinances to increase their fines. Currently, our fine is $100 a day for a blight violation, and the state legislation allows that to be increased from anywhere to about $200 a day to almost $1,000 a day if there's a vacant property that's on its third or more violation. But we are basically the immediate goal is to amend our ordinance to comply with the changes in the statute so that our fine amounts can be in accordance with state statute and can be increased. I think there was also potentially some discussion about looking at definitions of the blight in some other sections in the ordinance as well. But I think my understanding of the immediate goal is to make our statute compliance with make our ordinance compliance with the state statute, which comes into effect on October 1st of this year. So as of that date, municipalities can issue blight citations for the increased amounts.
So as those of us who are district representatives, and Jim has learned this in his few months already with us, we get a lot of calls from our constituents about blight in their neighborhoods. And this is a real thorn in people's sides. So one of the things that we've committed to do with working with the legal department is to look at a number of the ordinances in neighboring localities to see what it is that we think might be incorporated into our own blight definition. So we'll do that. So the next time we come back, the 2 things we'll be probably discussing is a new definition of blight as well as the increased fines. So we just wanted to introduce this idea to everybody, and we'll show you the new ordinance next time. And with that, I think that I could entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
You've got it, Jim. Alrighty, all in favor. Great. Thank you, everybody.
Good
We're done at
night.
8:35. Appreciate the help.
Thank
Alrighty, good night.
Good night.
Thanks, Matt.
Yep, no problem. My pleasure. Thanks.